Welcome back. In this set of lectures, I'm going to talk through Elliot Sober's essay, Philosophical Problems for Environmentalism. I'm going to just focus on the main points in this essay, so I won't touch on everything in it, but just highlight some features. Basically, what I will do is introduce each of the four arguments for environmentalism that Sober discusses, and then discuss Sober's objections to these arguments. Before getting to those arguments, however, I'd like to briefly talk through a few distinctions that Sober makes at the beginning of his article, particularly between what traditional ethics has to say about our moral obligations, responsibilities, or right moral conduct in relation to the environment, and what environmentalists have to say about that, as well as the difference between environmentalists and what he calls animal liberationists. It should be noted that by environmentalists here and environmentalism, Sober seems to mean a position that is ecocentric or biocentric. He doesn't use precisely those terms, but it seems like, for the most part, the theory that he has in mind, which he describes as environmentalist, holds that there's some value to, for instance, species as such, that goes beyond the value of individual organisms. So that position doesn't quite fit either into a utilitarian animal liberationist position like Peter Singer's, or into any of the traditional ethical positions of utilitarianism, Kantianism, or virtue ethics, at least not in an obvious way. So that's basically what he means by environmentalism, is something like ecocentrism or biocentrism. So a first point that Sober makes here that also helps him to narrow the scope of what he's going to talk about in his article is he notes that preserving an endangered species or ecosystem poses no special conceptual problem when the instrumental value of that species or ecosystem is known. And here I think he means instrumental value to humans. When we know that some endangered species or ecosystem has medical uses, for instance, medical value, or that it's important for human quality of life in some area, or human survival in some area even, then all of those are arguments for preserving the species or ecosystem, but they're all what we now have the terminology to call anthropocentric arguments. They're all arguments that can be made on the basis of most of the traditional ethical theories. So they're not, those kinds of arguments aren't conceptually hard to understand. Elliot Sober isn't going to discuss any philosophical problems associated with those kinds of traditional anthropocentric arguments for environmentalism. He's going to focus rather on non-anthropocentric arguments. The second distinction that Sober makes is between what he calls animal liberationists and environmentalists. And here he pretty clearly has in mind a position like Peter Singer's, a utilitarian position that says we have an obligation to take into consideration the pain and pleasure of animals that are affected by our actions, as well as of humans. And so a question that Sober discusses to try to clarify what the difference is between a utilitarian animal liberationist position like that and the more biocentric or ecocentric perspective of environmentalists is this question about whether the value of an individual organism in an endangered species is somehow greater than the value of an individual organism in a non-endangered species. He uses the example of whales. So imagine you have a whale in an endangered species, say a blue whale, and you have another whale in another species that has the same capacity for pleasure and pain as the whale in the endangered species. And the question is, do you owe more moral consideration to the whale that's in the endangered species than you do to the non-endangered species whale? And he says environmentalists generally think yes, because they think there's something good about preserving species as such. But animal liberationists don't see any relevant distinction. So there might be cases like those Ralston discusses, where we would actually cause more suffering to a group of animals then, we might choose an environmentalist, by Sober's description, might choose to cause more pain and suffering overall by, say, killing or letting die a larger number of individual organisms in order to preserve the existence of some endangered species. So clearly environmentalists, according to Sober's definition of that term, ecocentrists or biocentrists, are going to adopt different policies and believe that different actions are the right ones than animal liberationists are going to. So there's this distinction between these two. And just like Sober said, he's not going to consider the traditional ethical arguments. He's not going to consider animal liberationist style arguments either, kind of traditional utilitarian type arguments for paying attention to the well-being of non-human animals. He's going to focus on the more unusual arguments that don't fit into either the traditional or the utilitarian animal liberationist camps that have been offered by environmentalists. And these are basically, I think for our purposes, we can see that these are arguments that have a strong biocentric or ecocentric component or set of motives behind them.